The terminal light hummed, casting a pale glow across the desk. Numbers cascaded down the screen in a relentless, rhythmic tide. Beyond the glass walls of the office, the trading floor was a riot of noise, but Daniel did not look up. He focused on a single, jagged line in the corporate financial report. The global markets were screaming buy. Analysts on every screen were projecting record growth, and billions were flowing into the stock. Daniel ignored the hype. He dragged his cursor over the primary growth projections, then cross-referenced them against the debt servicing logs. A discrepancy flickered in the data, a missing billion in liabilities disguised as intangible assets. He blinked, leaned closer, and ran the calculation a second time. The result remained identical. The corporation was hollow. He tapped the desk, his jaw tight, his eyes moving across the columns with surgical precision. He had found the crack in the foundation. Outside, the market continued its upward climb, oblivious to the rot. Daniel pulled a blank page from his printer, his hands steady as he reached for a red pen. He would not rely on the consensus of the crowd. He would verify every digit until the truth was undeniable. The printer hummed, spitting out the pages. Daniel grabbed the red pen, his strokes sharp and deliberate as he circled the contradictions in the debt logs. He filled the margins with his own calculations, ignoring the distant roar of the trading floor. He stacked the papers neatly, walked to his desk, and slid them into the bottom drawer. The lock clicked, a final metallic seal on his secret. He stood in the silence of the office, the air still and cool against his skin. He took a slow breath, his voice barely a whisper in the empty space. Independent thought is the beginning of all achievement. The weight of the words settled his nerves. He sat down and opened the trading interface. His fingers hovered over the keyboard for a heartbeat. Then, he moved. He opened a series of long-term put options, committing his capital to a position that defied the entire market. He pressed enter. The order flashed, confirmed, and vanished into the digital ether. He was now betting against the darling of the financial world. He leaned back, watched the screen flicker, and felt the shift in his own center. The gamble was active. The bridge was burned. The market did not correct. Instead, it surged. Every hour, the stock price ticked upward, dragging the averages into record territory. The news cycle turned into a victory lap, and Daniel's screen showed a deepening hole in his account. His colleagues noticed. They began to drift toward his desk, their movements casual but their eyes sharp with curiosity. One stopped, leaning against the partition, a smirk etched across his face. "You are betting against the world, Daniel," he laughed, gesturing toward the green ticker overhead. The stock climbed another 5 points. A small crowd gathered. They pointed at his monitor, whispering, their laughter rhythmic and grating against the silence of his focus. They expected a reaction, a defense, a panicked justification, or an admission of error. Daniel gave them nothing. He did not look up. His fingers remained on the keys, his posture rigid and unyielding. He ignored the jabs and the dismissive shakes of their heads. When the laughter finally faded and the group dispersed, the silence returned to his office. He reached out and clicked his mouse, updating his spreadsheet with the latest numbers. The discrepancy remained. His logic stood firm. He continued to work as if the world were not betting against him. The seasons cycled through the office window, turning from summer heat to winter frost, but the market kept climbing. 12 months had passed. Daniel pulled up the annual performance summary. A quarter of his initial capital had vanished. The screen blinked with red digits, a persistent, jagged wound in his portfolio. He watched the numbers for a long minute, his reflection ghostly against the dark glass of the monitor. The silence of the office felt heavier now, weighted by the reality of his shrinking assets. He did not look away. He did not pace. He reached for a cloth and wiped a smudge from his screen, a rhythmic, mechanical motion that cleared his sight. He opened his master file again. He began to input the latest economic data, cross-referencing his original thesis against the new market realities. He checked the debt-to-equity ratios. He reviewed the revenue projections. The numbers were still flawed. The cracks he had identified were not hallucinations. They were structural failures that had simply not yet triggered a collapse. He saved the file, closed the redundant windows, and leaned forward. Fear was a biological response to danger, but Daniel treated it as a variable to be removed from his equation. He looked at the red numbers one last time, dismissed them, and started his work for the next day. The second year brought a different kind of pressure. The market continued its euphoric rise, and Daniel's name began to carry a new weight in his social circles. Invitations to dinners dried up. Phone calls stopped coming. He sat in his kitchen on a Friday night, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound in the room, staring at a calendar that had no plans. At the office, the whispers grew louder. He walked past the break room, and the conversation ceased instantly, replaced by sharp, sidelong glances. They called him the bear who lost his mind, a label meant to sting, to make him feel the absurdity of his position. He returned to his office, the quiet of his desk a stark contrast to the lively chatter of the trading floor outside. He walked to the window, watching the city lights flicker in the dark, a sprawling web of commerce that seemed to ignore his warnings entirely. He turned back to his desk, opened his laptop, and revisited his research. He went through the data line by line, recalculating the growth expectations and the debt ratios. He found no errors. He found no reason to change his path. He ignored the empty phone, the cold dinners, and the mocking labels. He stayed the course, grounded in the certainty of his own logic, even as the world around him grew increasingly hostile to his presence. The third year arrived like a hammer. His position was deep in the red, a massive, bleeding hole in his account that had long since surpassed his initial risk tolerance. He sat at his desk, the silence of the office now absolute. The trading floor outside was a blur of frantic activity, but in his corner, time seemed to stand still. A manager walked in, the sharp click of his heels echoing on the polished floor. He stopped at the desk, looked at the screen, and slid a pre-printed resignation form across the mahogany surface. The paper stopped right at the edge of Daniel's keyboard. The manager leaned down, hands flat on the desk, his voice low and clinical. "Stop the bleeding, Daniel. This is your exit." The request was a command. Daniel looked at the document, then back at the manager. He did not blink. He picked up the corner of the form and pushed it back across the desk, his movements slow and deliberate. His hands remained steady, not a tremor in his fingers. He looked the manager in the eye and said, "Persistence is the sustained effort necessary to induce faith." The manager stared for a moment, waiting for a retreat that did not come, then turned and left. Daniel closed his laptop, pushed the chair back, and stood up. He did not look at the stock price. He went back to his books, his studies, and his weight. The fourth year began with a subtle change in the air. The market, long intoxicated by its own growth, hit a wall. On a Tuesday morning, the quarterly earnings report for the corporation finally dropped. It missed the mark by $1 billion. The numbers hit the terminal screens at 10 in the morning. For 3 seconds, the trading floor went deathly silent. Then, the ticker began to bleed red. The stock dropped 10% in a single, violent hour. The sound of the room shifted instantly. The steady hum of clicking keys and low-level chatter shattered into a cacophony of shouting. Traders stood up at their desks, slamming down headsets. The screens that had displayed green indicators for years were now flashing warnings. The same colleagues who had spent months mocking Daniel were suddenly hunched over their phones, voices tight with urgency, frantically shouting sell orders into the air. The floor was no longer a place of confidence. It was a pressure cooker of sudden, sharp realization. Daniel sat in his chair, his gaze fixed on the scrolling red numbers. He did not move to his phone. He did not join the chorus of panicked voices. He simply watched the tide turn, the long-awaited collapse beginning to unfold in real time before his eyes. The descent was no longer a correction. It was a freefall. The stock price tore through support levels like paper, shedding value every time the ticker refreshed. On the trading floor, the panic matured into something sharper. The men who had laughed at his spreadsheets were now standing on their chairs, faces flushed, screaming into multiple phone lines at once. They were trying to offload positions that no longer held value. Keyboards clattered like gunfire under the pressure of desperate commands. The air in the room grew thin, heavy with the scent of stagnant coffee and nervous sweat. Daniel remained anchored at his desk. He opened his portfolio window. The red digits had vanished, replaced by a deep, steady green that climbed with every point the stock dropped. His long-term put options were no longer theories or models. They were a massive, materialized windfall. He watched the final numbers lock into place as the market halted trading. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the sound of heavy breathing from the desks surrounding him. He did not cheer. He did not stand. He simply clicked the mouse, refreshing the screen one last time to confirm the final total, and leaned back into his chair. The frantic noise of the floor died away, leaving only the mechanical hum of cooling fans and the distant, muffled sound of sirens outside. The screens were static now. The trading halted. Daniel sat in the center of the quiet, the only person in the room who was not looking at a phone. He closed his laptop with a sharp final click. The sound echoed. A young analyst, his face pale and eyes wide, drifted away from his own station and stopped at the edge of Daniel's desk. The young man held a printout of the day's losses, his hands trembling slightly. He looked at the empty space on the desk where the resignation papers had once sat, then back at Daniel. He seemed to be searching for a secret, some hidden algorithm or insider signal that had guided the trade. Daniel stood up. He did not look at the other desks. He did not look at the men who had mocked him for years. He smoothed the surface of his desk, picked up his briefcase, and turned toward the glass partition. The air felt colder, stripped of the tension that had defined his life for 4 seasons. He walked toward the exit, his pace steady, leaving the carnage of the market behind him. The analyst blocked the doorway, his voice barely a whisper above the cooling hum of the server room. "What was the hardest part?" he asked, looking at the empty desk. Daniel stopped. He turned to face the young man, his posture relaxed, his gaze fixed on the exit signs glowing in the corridor. He did not talk about the money. He did not talk about the market. It was remaining disciplined while everyone else disagreed, Daniel said. The words hung in the air, stripped of pretense. He pushed the glass door open and stepped into the hallway. The office was behind him now, a place where he had spent 4 years in deliberate, quiet isolation. He walked toward the elevators, his stride rhythmic against the polished floor. The profit in his account was a balance sheet entry, a footnote compared to the internal foundation he had built during the long, red years of doubt. He pressed the button for the lobby. He did not glance back at the rows of desks or the men who had once mocked his logic. He had proven that temporary defeat was not failure. He stepped into the lift, watched the doors slide shut, and left the silence of his own victory behind him.